I would now like to invite the former Chief Justice, Asif Saeed Khosa, to please come and say a few words. A big round of applause for our Chief Guest.
The administration of the Arts Council, organizers of the Adab Festival, respectable panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Before I say anything else, let me remember the legendary Honorable Justice retired Fakhruddin Ji Ibrahim, who passed away a few weeks ago. Fakhru Bhai, as all of us fondly knew him, was an icon in ways more than one. He served this country as an accomplished lawyer, judge of a high court, judge of the Supreme Court, Attorney General, Minister for Law, Governor, and lastly, as the Chief Election Commissioner. In each of such sensitive positions, he served with independence, ability, grace, and dignity, and earned nothing but respect and reverence. The vacuum created by his passing away shall be hard to fill, and he shall be remembered for a long time. May his soul rest in eternal peace. Ameen. While making an attempt to emulate Mr. Anwar Maqsood, whom I admire a lot, I would like to start my discourse in this Adab festival as follows. The emphasis would be on Adab. अंग्रेजी अदब की तालीम हासिल किए तकरीबन 45 बरस गुजर चुके। अब तो शेक्सपियर भी सदियों पुराने लगने लगा। अंग्रेजी अदब के बाद कानून में जानुए अदब तय किया। वकालत के दौर में अदब तो पीछे रह गया और ज़्यादा जोर आदाब पर रहा। फिर काजी के मनसब पर फायज हुए तो अदब और आदाब तो दूर की बात, ज़्यादा फिक्र इस बात की रही कि कोई बेअदब फरते जज्बात में बेअदबी न कर दे। कज़ा के मनसब में बहुत सौ की तुम पर पाँव पड़ जाता है। अदब से कराहना समझ में आता है, लेकिन बुहतान तराशी और साजिशी मफरूज़ों की तरफ माइल होना इंतहाई गैर मुनासिब है। खैर, अब अदब की तरफ वापसी का इरादा है और इसके लिए कुशादा दिली का तकाजे के तहत मुस्तकबिल पर नज़र है, माजी पर नहीं। Today I have decided to speak on literature in law. You are quite familiar with father-in-law, brother and sister-in-law, and of course mother-in-law. And you will be pleased to know that literature and law also have a relationship which is equally passionate and to some traditionalists equally problematic and for some irritable. It is difficult to define literature, but generally it is understood to be a piece of writing having an artistic or an intellectual value or merit. Usual communication between human beings is through the medium of words, but literature is that communication which deploys words or language in a manner which pleases the ear, heart, or mind, or tickles the finer sensibilities in a person and assumes the status of an art. Literature is generally classified as fiction or non-fiction and poetry or prose, with subcategories of novel, short story, and drama. Art is sometimes for art's sake, but on other occasions it is employed as a tool or a technique while speaking or writing about a mundane or a professional subject or issue. And it is this latter aspect which is the focus of my discourse today. The art thus employed essentially boosts expression, elevating the text to the status of literature. The definition of literature in the Encyclopedia Britannica classifies literature as the best expression of the best thought reduced to writing. It is the use of good words or expression which may sometimes transform even a judgment of a court into a piece of literature, not only relevant to the parties to the case in issue, but also appealing to a bigger audience. Literature, or the use of it, is not to be confined or restricted to what the literati, authors, writers, poets, or scholars indulge in, and judges in different parts of the world also sometimes quote literature to embellish, embroider, or decorate their judgments, refer to literary masterpieces to emphasize or explain a point, or even create literature through the use of prose of artistic merit and expressions of high literary value while composing their judgments. There are also instances in the world where judges have written the entire judgments in poetry. Literature essentially deals with human feelings, emotions, conduct, or behavior, and so does the law. Not many people know that many famous literary figures were also lawyers or were involved in law, and they include Henry Fielding, John Donne, Francis Bacon, Goethe, Hoffman, Heine, Kafka, Alexander McCall Smith, William Faulkner, and Bernhard Schlink. They were all lawyers by profession. Charles Dickens, the great Victorian novelist, had remained a lawyer's apprentice. In this backdrop, references found in their works to law, lawyers, legal profession, or imaginary court cases is not surprising. The plot thickens when it is realized that many judges in different parts of the world, including myself, had studied literature as a subject in their colleges or universities. Interestingly, the United States Supreme Court Judge Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. was elected class poet as a student at Harvard University. It is thus not surprising that judges and lawyers sometimes refer to literature, and literary figures often write about law and lawyers. The case in point is Geoffrey Chaucer's portrayal of the man of law in his prologue to the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer, the great English poet in the 14th century, exclaimed in The Man of Law, "Nowhere so busy a man he there was, and yet he seemed busier than he was." Even Shakespeare wrote in Henry VI, "The first thing we should do is, let us kill all the lawyers." Down the ages, law and literature have mingled in many ways. It needs to be understood that writing judgments is an art and not a science, and that is why it is called composing a judgment. And an artist cannot be put to a straitjacket of a particular form or format. Citing literature in judicial opinions can be a versatile technique which, if used sparingly and with care, can embellish a judgment. Many a time, law has also been taken up by literary artists as a major or minor thematic concern in their works, like Antigone, The Merchant of Venice, The Pickwick Papers, The Mill on the Floss, etc. Literature has often helped the ingenious advocates in being emphatic in their arguments by quoting from great literary texts. Literature has also at times become a part of courtroom judgments in the hands of erudite judges. References to literature in legal judgments abound in the Indo-Pak subcontinent, and some recent articles written by Sonakshi Avasthi and Surbi Kapoor from India, Chanima Vijay Jayabandra from Sri Lanka refer to many such judgments rendered by different courts. A recent article jointly written by Aisha Tariq, an assistant professor at Lahore, and Jhanvi Prakash a clerk cum legal researcher of a judge of the Supreme Court of India, is also quite illustrative of the subject. I must acknowledge that for preparation of today's speech, I have considerably benefited from the material available in the research undertaken by the above-mentioned writers. There are many instances where judges in different parts of the world have referred to different pieces of existing literature in their judgments. Here are a few samples from the Gladioscope. In the United Kingdom, in the case of Jura Temp Ventures, the House of Lords, while interpreting the word dwelling, referred to the Holy Bible, also referred to the Mikado Act 2 by W.S. Gilbert, and also to Paradise Lost by Milton. In the Powell-Bacharach case, the High Court of Justice, Queen's Bench Division of England, dealing with a case of extradition of a Polish national, referred to Victor Hugo's great novel, Les Miserables. In the United States of America, in the case of Gavin Grimm, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit referred to and reproduced the poem Famous by the Palestinian-American writer Naomi Shihab Nye. In the case of Parhat versus Yates, the United States Court of Appeal, District Court of Columbia, dealing with a case of detention at the United States Naval Base at Guantanamo Bay, referred to the poem The Hunting of the Snark by Lewis Carroll, the author of popular children's book Alice in Wonderland. In Australia, in the case of Sabah Brothers, the Federal Magistrates Court of Australia quoted from the Trial by Kafka. Now in India, there have been many instances, and they're very interesting. In his post on LinkedIn, dated February 13, 2017, Justice retired Barkande Katju of the Supreme Court of India wrote about the power of Urdu poetry and my Supreme Court judgments and stated as follows. As I mentioned before, Faiz Sahib is my favorite Urdu poet of the 20th century, though I regard Mirza Ghalib the greatest Urdu poet of all times. So I quoted him in some judgments of mine in the Supreme Court, beginning the judgment with his couplet. When I decided to issue an appeal through my judgment to the Pakistan government to release an Indian citizen, Gopal Das, who was undergoing a life sentence in Pakistan for espionage and had been in Pakistani jails for 27 years, I began with a couplet of Faiz. Kafas udas hai yaro sabah se kuch to kaho, kahin to behre khuda aaj zikr yaar chale. Then Justice Katju writes that this couplet had such a powerful impact on the Pakistani authorities that they announced that Pakistan government would honor the appeal made by the Indian Supreme Court. Gopal Das was released a few days thereafter and he came back to India and has got married. Then Justice Katju writes, this was unprecedented. Never perhaps in world judicial history was such an appeal made by any court, and never was it so honored. Such is the power of Urdu poetry. The next case to be mentioned is the case of a petition to allow euthanasia or mercy killing. Aruna Shonbaum was a nurse at Mumbai King Edward Memorial Hospital who was sexually assaulted in the year 1973 by a hospital staff, and she had been in a vegetative state for the next 37 years. While considering a request for her mercy killing, Justice Katju quoted the following couplet of Mirza Ghalib in his judgment to convey the pain and agony that that nurse had gone through all those years. मरते हैं आरज़ू में मरने की, मौत आती है पर नहीं आती. Apart from Urdu couplets, judges often incorporate works of famous writers in their judgments. In 2003, hearing an appeal of a lawyer regarding his alleged professional misconduct with his client, the judges added a light humor in the ruling, citing a line from Shakespeare's Henry VI, which I've already read out. The first thing we should do is let us kill all the lawyers. That's what Shakespeare said. While adjudicating on the service conditions of women serving in the armed forces of India, the Delhi High Court had quoted the following couplet in the year 2018. तेरे माथे पे ये आंचल तो बहुत खूब है, लेकिन तो इस आंचल से एक परचम बना लेती तो अच्छा था. In a case in the year 2012, the Delhi High Court had referred to the following couplet in a judgment while commenting upon the general insensitivity in the metropolitan city whenever a heinous crime was committed in full public view, but those witnessing the crime refused to become witnesses in the court. The couplet read, लगता है शहर में नए आए हो, रुक गए हो राह हादसा देखकर. In another case about adoption of orphan children, Delhi High Court quoted Nida Fazli in the year 2015 as follows. घर से मस्जिद है बहुत दूर, चलो यूं कर लें, किसी रोते हुए बच्चे को हंसाया जाए. In another case in the year 2016, Delhi High Court quoted the following couplet of Dal Delvi while commenting upon the working of CBI, Central Bureau of Intelligence. खूब पर्दा है कि चिलमन से लगे बैठे हैं, साफ छुपते भी नहीं, सामने आते भी नहीं. In the same case, the court also quoted the following couplet of Kaif Gopali. जनाब कैफ, ये दिल्ली है बीरो गालिब की, यहाँ किसी की तरफदारियां नहीं चलती. In Buddhadev case, Justice Markandeya Katju and Gyan Sudha Mishra of the Indian Supreme Court upheld the sentence of imprisonment for life imposed upon the accused for the murder of a sex worker. That judgment referred to many literary works from the great Bengali writer Sarat Chandra Chattopadhyay's novel Shrikant and Devdas, to Dostoevsky's famous novel Crime and Punishment, and also Amrapali, a contemporary of Lord Buddha, and to Urdu poet Sahir Ludhianvi's poem Chakle. In the Indian case of Hitesh Bhatnagar, the Indian Supreme Court commented upon that, this is interesting, that though marriages are made in heaven, it is said we are more often than not made to wonder what happened to them by the time they descended down to earth. While concluding the judgment in that case of a divorce action, the court quoted George Eliot's novel Adam Bede and observed, and quote, this is the quotation, we conclude by quoting the great poet George Eliot, who said, what greater thing is there for two human souls than to feel that they are joined for life, to strengthen each other in all labor, to rest on each other in all sorrow, to minister each other in all pain, to be one with each other in silent, unspeakable memories at the moment of last parting. In Sri Lanka, the play by Measure for Measure, a play by Shakespeare, had been cited to emphasize that the freedom of the press was to be balanced against the rights of those who are innocent. The court wrote, it surely does allow the pen of the journalist to be used as a mighty sword to rip open the facades which hide misconduct and corruption, but it is a two-edged weapon which he must wield with care, not to wound the innocent while exposing the guilty. As Shakespeare put it, oh, it is excellent to have a giant's strength, but it is tyrannous to use it like a giant. In another Sri Lankan case about inheritance of property, a poem from Alfred Lord Tennyson was quoted, which read, "Mastering the lawless science of our law, mastering the lawless science of our law, that codeless myriad of precedent, that wilderness of single instances through which a few, by wit or fortune led, may beat a pathway out to wealth and fame." In Papua New Guinea, in the case of the state versus Alan Voyla, the National Court of Papua New Guinea referred to Charles Dickens' novel Oliver Twist to describe a dock in a courtroom. In another case in the National Court of Papua New Guinea, what was referred was Lolita, one of the most controversial classic novels of Vladimir Nabokov. In Fiji Islands, the Court of Appeal of Fiji Islands referred in a case to a poem by Rudyard Kipling. The poem was titled Dawn Wind. The couplet mentioned was, "At 2 o'clock in the morning, if you open your window and listen, you will hear the feet of the wind that is going to call the sun." In his article, Jennifer Davis, and in his post, Brendan Fitzgerald had mentioned that several judges in the United States of America had a penchant for poetry, and many of them managed to weave their love of verse into their legal careers. The said authors then took a walk on what they called the quirky side of law, that is, the court opinions written in rhyme. You will enjoy this because these are judgments which are written in poems. The entire judgment is a poem, so you may find it hilarious. There was a case in which a tree was hit by a Chevrolet car, which is generally referred to in America as Chevy. A Chevy hit a tree, the tree was damaged. The owner of the tree filed a suit for damages against the driver, the owner, and the insurer. This was the case of Fisher versus Lowe. A tree was hit and damaged by a car carelessly driven, and the owner of the tree had sued the owner, driver, and insurer of the car for damages. The trial court passed its judgment in lyrical form and observed as follows. This is hilarious. "A wayward Chevy struck a tree whose owner sued defendants 3. He sued car's owner, driver 2, and insurer for what was due. For his oak tree that now may bear a lasting need for tender care." And then the poem goes on and the decision was given, and an appeal was filed against the decision. The appellate court also wrote a judgment in poem. This again is interesting. The appellate court referred to Joyce Gilmore's well-known poem Trees and said, "We thought that we would never see a suit to compensate a tree, a suit whose claim in tort is pressed upon a mangled tree's behest, a tree whose battered trunk was pressed against a Chevy's crumpled crest, a tree that faces each new day with bark and limb in disarray, a tree that may forever bear a lasting need for tender care. Flora lovers, though we 3," the judges are talking about themselves, that we are also flora lovers. "Flora lovers, though we 3, we must affirm the court's decree." The next case is even more hilarious. This is also in poem. Among the best known judicial lyricists, we call them judicial lyricists. Among the best known judicial lyricists is retired Justice Michael Eakin, who served on the Supreme Court of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. In Little versus Schultz, a contract claim in which the buyer of 2 emus sued the seller when the birds failed to procreate. The buyer had bought a couple of emus to breed chicks from them and to sell them and to make a lot of money. But the birds, unfortunately, were sterile, or probably they didn't procreate. so the buyer sued the seller. The court writes in the judgment form, the emus is a bird quite large and stately, whose market potential was valued so greatly that a decade ago it was thought to be the boom crop of the 21st century. Our appellant decided she ought to invest in two breeding emus, but their conjugal nest produced no chicks, so she tried to regain her purchase money, but alas, in vain. Appellant then filed a contract suit, but the verdict gave her claim the boot. Thus, she was left with no resort but this appeal to the superior court. The learned trial court, in well-reasoned words, held Liddell's case was flightless as the birds, and her appeal in turn we now must find as barren as the breeders here maligned. The third lyrical judgment I want to mention briefly is where the lawyers had submitted their briefs in rhyme. The lawyers' briefs, their submissions in the court were in the form of poetry. The judges didn't want to remain behind, and this is what the district judge, Edward Becker, wrote. The motion now before us has stirred up a terrible fuss, and what is considerably worse, it has spawned some preposterous doggerel verse. And it goes on, and the end part is, overwhelmed by this outburst of pure creativity, we determined to show an equal proclivity, hence this poem in the form of verse, even if not of the caliber of St. John Peirce. The next topic that I briefly want to refer to is that in Pakistan also, there have been judges who have been referring to literature. In Pakistan, there have been judgments in which Mr. Justice Jawad S. Khaja, Justice Chaudhry Ijaz Ahmed, and some other judges have referred to Persian couplets of Hafiz Shirazi and Sheikh Saadi, Urdu couplets of Allama Iqbal, and Punjabi couplets of Bulle Shah. I too had ventured in this field and had frequently referred to some masterpieces from English literature, having decided about 57,000 cases over the last about 22 years. I cannot recount all the instances where I had quoted from great literary works, but for the present purposes, I may refer only to a few of my recently rendered judgments. In the case of 18th and 21st constitutional amendments, I quoted Francis Bacon and Khalil Gibran's poem on children and Groucho Marx's observation. This was a case of military courts, and I refer to Groucho Marx, who had said, military justice is to justice what military music is to music. In the case of Ishaq Khakwani about Articles 62 and 62 and 63 of the Constitution, I quoted George Bernard Shaw, Abraham Lincoln, Montesquieu, and William Shakespeare. In the blasphemy case of Musammat Asiya Bibi, I quoted from Shakespeare in the following words: blasphemy is a serious offense, but the insult of the appellant's religion and religious sensibilities by the complainant party, appellant was Musammat Asiya Bibi. Insult of the appellant's religion and religious sensibilities by the complainant party, and then mixing truth with falsehood in the name of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was also not short of being blasphemous. It is ironical that in the Arabic language, the appellant's name Asiya means sinful. Asiya is written with Alif Mada or with An. The one with An means sinful. But in the circumstances of the present case, she appears to be a person, in the words of Shakespeare's King Lear, more sinned against than sinning. In the Panama Papers case, I quoted Balzac, Mario Puzo, Christopher Marlowe's Tamberlane, and Dr. Faustus and William Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. In the contempt case against Prime Minister Gilani, I quoted from John Donne's For Whom the Bell Tolls, had reproduced Khalil Gibran's poem on crime and punishment, and also had reproduced Pity the Nation by Khalil Gibran. And with an apology to Khalil Gibran, the circumstances of the case persuaded me to add a few lines of my own to the latter poem. I don't want to read that poem, it's a little bit longish, when I said, pity the nation that achieves nationhood in the name of a religion, but pays little heed to truth, righteousness, and accountability, which are the essence of every religion. Pity the nation that proclaims democracy as its policy, but restricts it to queuing up for casting of ballots only and discourages democratic values. Pity the nation that measures honor with success and respect with authority, that despises sublime and cherishes mundane, that treats a criminal as a hero and considers civility as weakness, and that deems a sage a fool and venerates the wicked. Pity the nation that adopts a constitution but allows political interests to outweigh constitutional diktat. Pity the nation that demands justice for all but is agitated when justice hurts its political loyalty. Pity the nation whose servants treat their solemn oaths as nothing more than a formality before entering upon an office. Pity the nation that elects a leader as a redeemer, but expects him to bend every law to favor his benefactors. Pity the nation whose leaders seek martyrdom through disobeying the law, than giving sacrifices for the glory of law, and who see no shame in crime. Pity the nation that is led by those who laugh at the law, little realizing that the law shall have the last laugh. Pity the nation that launches a movement for rule of law, but cries foul when the law is applied against its bigwigs, that reads judicial verdicts through political glasses, and that permits skills of advocacy to be practiced more vigorously outside the courtroom than inside. Pity the nation that punishes its weak and poor, but is shy of bringing its high and mighty to book. Pity the nation that clamors for equality before law, but has selective justice close to its heart. Pity the nation that thinks from its heart and not from its head. Indeed, pity the nation that does not discern villainy from nobility. This is what I want to refer to two pieces from my judgments. I'm sorry, one should not quote oneself. Where you will find that a normal subject was tried to be transformed into some kind of literature. There was a gentleman called Dilbar. He liked a girl, he wanted to marry her. She refused. He killed her by giving a stab blow in her chest. He was sentenced to death. Ordinarily, a judge would start his judgment. The Dilbar appellant had killed such and such lady, and he was sentenced to death by the trial court, and hence this appeal before this court. Now, I decided to play on the word Dilbar. His name was Dilbar. So I started my judgment. Dilbar appellant is a lady killer, but of a different kind. After failing to win over the heart of his beloved through his amorous pursuits or masculine charms, he reached her heart through the blade of a dagger. And for such heartless killing, he was sentenced by the trial court to death. So a normal sentence can even be transformed into something appealing to a person interested in literature. The next case was very sensitive. There was a gentleman from Pakistan, a young boy, went to France to study, fell in love with a French girl, got married to her. They produced a boy. The boy was 5 or 6 years old. They were living in France. And then marriage, unfortunately, hit turbulence. Unfortunately, later on, a divorce followed. That gentleman from Pakistan brought that boy to Pakistan surreptitiously in a clandestine manner. And then that French young lady followed him to Pakistan And after many months of search through the help of the local police, the boy was found, the man was found, they were brought to the court. The matter before me came as a matter of custody of the child. The argument was, here is a Muslim Pakistani man, a boy born to that Muslim Pakistani, and on the other hand, the mother is French and a Christian. So, what should be the fate of the case? Whom should be given the custody? I gave the custody to that French lady. And this is what I wrote, because you will see a lot of passion in this piece. It's just a paragraph that I want to read out, and to show that how literature helps you create an emotional argument in support of the legal argument. After hearing the learned counsel for the parties and the learned officers at some length, and after going through the material and the precedent cases referred to by them, I must observe that I have felt distressed over some of the arguments addressed by the learned counsel for respondent number one. Respondent number one was the boy, was the husband. Particularly those based upon different faiths professed by the contesting parties to this case and different nationalities and cultures they come from. It is proverbial that all is fair in love and war, and in the present case it appears that respondent number one actually believes in that. When it came to falling in love with a Christian girl, religion did not matter to respondent number one. When it came to marriage and settling down, French nationality of the petitioner and France as an abode did not bother respondent number one. When it came to producing a child and bringing him up in France, religious inclinations of the spouse and Western culture did not make any difference to respondent number one. For respondent number one, religion, nationality, and culture did not have much significance as long as it suited him. But when the marital relations between respondent number one and the petitioner hit turbulence and ultimately came to a dead end in the war of sorts that ensued over custody of the child, respondent number one has now found it to be advantageous and convenient to take shelter behind faith, nationality, and culture. To respondent number one, it may appear to be a fair ruse or a stratagem in the war over custody of the child, but I have found such volte-face on the part of respondent number one to be offensive to justice, equity, and good conscience. Then I give the credentials of the husband and say, with such credentials and antecedents of respondent number one, mere professing of Muslim faith by him, and his mere incidents of birth in Pakistan may not suffice all by themselves to conclude that welfare of the minor would lie in living with him, rather than in living with a Christian mother of French origin, whose credentials are blotless, whose antecedents are clean, whose proven love and care for the child has dragged her in foreign land, facing untold trials and tribulations, and whose courage, fortitude, and character may be better suited for imbibing good moral, social, and human values in the minor's personality. Now, the next point that I want to refer to is that literature, on many occasions, has been a catalyst for change of laws. Charles Dickens' novels about the poor conditions in the Victorian times brought about improved legislation by the Parliament for the poor citizens. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin in the year 1852 highlighted the horrors of slavery and contributed towards the abolitionist movement. The novel Jungle by Sinclair highlighted the plight of the immigrant laborers working in the meatpacking industry in Chicago, which led to fresh legislation. Then John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath also talked about migrants and their plight during the Great Depression and led to reform of labor laws. And then finally, Nadine Gordimer, who was a South African writer, she started writing against apartheid and then ultimately it became a movement and apartheid laws were abolished in South Africa. So this again, a link between literature and law. Now my last piece is about situations where literature comes in handy when judges can't say things themselves. Judges don't respond to criticism, judges don't really say much. They're not supposed to say much about whatever people are saying. So this is about that part. Literature sometimes comes in handy when no other recourse is available to a judge. Only a few weeks before my retirement, some constitutional and legal questions were asked in a case about those who had never been questioned before. As expected, such intervention invited the ire of many, and resultantly, conspiracy theorists started working full-time, painting a doomsday scenario. Judges normally do not respond to such reactions, but through my speech in the farewell reference, literature provided me an opportunity, and I read out the following part of the poem written by Fahmida Riaz. And this was, कुछ लोग तुम्हें समझाएंगे, वो तुमको खौफ दिलाएंगे, जो है वो भी खो सकता है, इस राह में राज़न है इतने, कुछ और यहाँ हो सकता है, कुछ और तो अक्सर होता है, पर तुम जिस लम्हे में जिंदा हो, ये लम्हा तुमसे जिंदा है, ये वक्त नहीं फिर आएगा, तुम अपनी करनी कर गुजरो, जो होगा देखा जाएगा. Now, this poem was titled Faiz Kehte and written by Fahmida Riaz. If somebody asks me, I'll say, I didn't say it. Fahmida Riaz said it. If you ask Fahmida Riaz, she'll say, I never said it. I said Faiz will say it, would have said this. And if you ask poor Faiz, he would say, I am dead and gone for a long time. I never said it. So this is the beauty of literature. And this is also one of the utilities of literature in law. Thank you very much.